Wavelength.
Just because we're doing our lectures online doesn't mean that we need to then retreat and make life, all about being alone.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide.
I think there's not enough knowledge around the severity of the long-term impacts that a concussion can give you, and it's not really educated enough.
You should be having.
The minimum job search requirements is definitely problematic, and it is up to a computer to decide whether you receive your payments each month.
This is Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Welcome back to Wavelength, Spark the Convos about Adelaide you should be having. We are your hosts. I'm Cass and I'm here with Maggie.
Hello everyone. I hope you are all having a great week so far. Before we jump in, we do need to acknowledge that we are recording Wavelength on the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respects to elders past and present.
We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that they are in continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today, and we also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. It's been a bit of a big week, or big 2 weeks we haven't been on air, but it's been a bit crazy.
It's been a big fortnight for news, absolutely. I mean, it always is.
It always is. We have Woolies and Koul's announced over $1.62 billion profits. People have not been okay about that. A lot of price gouging. Yeah, it hasn't been fantastic for them.
Totally. And I get it's just with the cost of living as it is right now, it's just tone deaf.
Absolutely.
Honestly, announcing this kind of gross profit when there's people who can't even afford to buy food I definitely understand the backlash.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And there's been a lot of graffiti happening in shops. I don't know if you've seen this online.
I've seen a bit, yeah.
Look, I find it quite funny. But someone's written at Koul's down, morality's down, which is, I think, very funny to me personally. And a lot about farmers not being paid enough and employees not paid enough as well, which is pretty scary. So
I totally get why people feel, why they need to lash out against these big conglomerates who aren't paying, their producers. They're not paying their employees who are basically on minimum wage enough. Honestly, it's crazy.
It is terrifying. Alrighty, let's jump in. Hey, as per usual, we have a jam-packed episode for you tonight. We talk about the Women's World Cup with Val Miliaccio.
Then later on, Liliana talks you through the equal AFL prizing pool. And Trevor will take you through all the good news that has happened this week.
But before all of that, I talk with Claire McAdam from the Salvation Army about their up-and-coming Sleepout.
Cass, take it away.
Salvos is challenging South Australians to sleep rough to raise funds for those experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Could you please explain to our listeners what the Sleepout entails and how listeners can get involved?
Yes, we're really excited to be running the first Salvos Sleepout SA. We're hoping to attract about 40 members of the community who will join us to sleep out on Saturday the 16th of September at our Parafield Gardens site. This is a closed site, so people who are doing this event will be quite safe. And we're inviting them to sign up to raise money from their friends and family and networks. We have a total of about $15,000 that we would like to raise, which will go directly to the work that we do in the northern suburbs. And basically participants rock up with their sleeping bag, their blankets, their pillows and whatever else will keep them warm. We spend an hour or so with them just talking about the work that we do and the impact that they will have by doing their fundraising and standing up for those who are experiencing homelessness. And then they settle down for the evening. Around about 6 o'clock in the morning, our emergency services truck will offer a hot breakfast, and then we anticipate people will be on their way.
What are the most significant contributing factors to homelessness in South Australia?
Unfortunately, it's the case that mental health has a lot to do with homelessness in terms of people who experience that on an ongoing basis. Obviously, the current cost of living and the rise in rents, these all contribute to family breakdown and domestic violence. And that's a significant contributor and also obviously involves children, which is very sad. And then really people who really are struggling to access housing. Who might be single, they might have a job, but they're really not able to make ends meet.
How does homelessness intersect with other social issues such as mental health, addiction and unemployment?
So basically somebody who doesn't have a safe place to go home in the evening, this has a significant impact on their mental health and their sense of well-being. A lot of people carry a huge sense of shame when they're homeless. Obviously, they're not able to keep clean and they can't care for themselves. Access to basic essentials like showers and toilets and laundry is really tricky. And basically somebody who is in that situation finds it really hard to be reliable and attend a job interview, and feels really isolated and lonely.
What impact do you hope the Sleep Out event will have on addressing homelessness in South Australia?
So we have a range of services in Northern Adelaide that meet people's needs when they're struggling with homelessness, as we've just talked about, but they could also be finding it difficult to put food on the table for their children before they go to school. And so what we're hoping is that the money that we raise from the Sleep Out will allow us to add to the services that we already offer. So, for example, if we can only provide breakfast 2 days a week, we'd like to be able to provide it 5 days a week. If people are coming to us for food vouchers and food hampers and we can only offer that 2 or 3 days a week, we'd like to be able to offer it more frequently. So we're really wanting the difference to be that we can help more people more of the time. People often ask us how they can help people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And there's some really practical ways that people can do that. An awareness of a website called Street to Home is important. If you go on your search engine and look for that, that allows you to pinpoint where you might have seen someone who you think is struggling, who might be sitting on the pavement or looking really lost and alone. And we can confirm that a team will go out to that space that you've tagged on the map and see that person within a few hours. And see if they can receive any assistance and support. So that's a very practical way. There's also an app called Affordable SA, and that gives access to a whole range of services that anybody who's looking for help and practical assistance can access. And the other thing is we really do encourage people to be compassionate, and if they see someone who's alone or who looks really sad and might need some help, to just give them a smile and give them the time of day. That could be the only positive interaction they have that day.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Cass and Claire. If you want to get involved in the Sleep Out, it's happening on the 16th of September and you can find out more info on their website.
Up next, we talk about the Women's World Cup. You're listening to Wavelength here on Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking convos about Adelaide you should be having. A couple of months ago, we did a story about the Women's World Cup and it was centred around not getting enough media attention for this global event.
Yes, well, we can very happily admit that we got this story very, very wrong. And God, I love being wrong about things like this. The Women's World Cup blew up in a very big way this year.
It really did. It was huge and we saw Australia unite in such a special way and it was different.
It was more than I could ever imagine.
I know.
It made me so
insane.
Unbelievably happy, and I feel like the momentum's still going. To find out a little bit more and to right our wrongs, Marco talks with Val Miliaccio.
Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Val, we talked about the importance of this great event for our state, for our nation. Did you think we made the most of it?
In the end, I think we did, because the stadiums proved that people were actually really excited about this Women's World Cup, and especially seeing all the games here in Adelaide. And then, a lot of the stadiums full, the buzz, everybody was talking about it. AFL teams are actually jumping on board. Australia was united, which is very unique for a sport. What I think had happened, despite the lack of media coverage, and I thought the media coverage leading into it was extremely poor, was people have got enough social media, they jumped on board with it. And the thing was, the final was probably the perfect final. And Spain obviously had become the champions of the world. What concerns me the most is, and predicted this a long, long time ago, that a lot of what's going to happen after this World Cup, we're not going to be ready for it. There's going to be a big influx of female players. Boys now have got superstars in their minds, such as Sam Kerr, Hermoso from Spain. From me being involved in a football club very closely locally, the club I was with was no way ready, and I don't think there's any club in South Australia in particular that's ready for this influx, and that disappoints me the most.
So Val, knowing that the state government and federal government is going to put a lot of money into women's sport now and women's soccer, what do you think it's going to be the impact that we can see not only on women's sport but in the whole sports scene in Australia thanks to the World Cup?
Well, the impact is that now there's a big focus on women's sport in particular and women's football, and it's great that the government's getting on board, and that's in South Australia and federally. But what I'd like to see personally is coaching. I think more money needs to go into the technical aspect of coaching. That's where we fall down. I've known this through experience that a lot of the coaches in junior women's football in particular, their parents who are volunteers, who love the game, but they're not the best people to guide our women. And we can see the growth of the game right across the world. Europe has exploded in the last 8 or 9 years with crowds. You see England, Italy, Spain, everybody's growing, and we've got to make the most of the grants, and we need some of that grant, like I said, to get the best coaches. And I'm not saying just locally, we have to actually attract coaches from right around the world, and Pep Montemuro from Juventus is probably an ideal person to get involved in this game, because now what he's doing with Juventus, and Juventus, one of the biggest clubs in the world, has employed an Australian to look after their women's team. That's the type of people we need in the game to actually direct what's going to happen.
Val, you've been in Canada for the Women's World Cup, you've been in France for the Women's World Cup in 2019, and you watched all the games in South Australia, especially for the Women's World Cup. Do you think we've hosted the best World Cup ever in the history of the women's soccer?
Yeah, you can't even compare. We did by a million miles, and I was lucky enough to be in Canada, and Canada's very similar to Australia, where football was number 3, maybe even number 4, even number 5 sport. You walk around some of the cities, I was, Moncton, Ottawa, Edmonton, and you wouldn't know that there was any World Cup going on, but the crowd still turned up. But I recall an Australian game in Edmonton, the stadium was only a third full, whereas in Australia, our stadiums were full. It didn't matter who played. France was spectacular because it's a football nation, so you had a lot more of that football culture in the way of cheering. But again, nowhere as good as what we had done in Australia, and it's just fantastic, and it proves that there is an appetite for women's sport, women's football in particular. And I think if our Football Australia, Football SA, the clubs all unite, become one and work together, we can become very, very powerful through the women's game. Because the women's game, why do the AFL jump on top of this? Because they're not a threat to the men, right? So we can do this, but we have to be united.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Marco and Val. Next, we talk about the equal AFL prizing pool. You're listening to Wavelength. Keep it on Fresh.
Wavelength.
Welcome back to Wavelength, sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Following the World Cup, there was news that the AFL would be giving an equal prize pool for women's football. This is a good thing, right? Liliana explains.
Wavelength explains on Fresh 92.7.
Prize money for the AFLW will almost double in the coming season, bringing it in line with the men's competition for the first time. The AFL announced on Monday the financial rewards in Season 8 of the Women's League will rise from $634,000 to $1.1 million to be split among the top 8 teams. AFL executive Andrew Dillon described it as a great announcement. "We have 2 of the best sporting competitions in the country," he said. "I'm pleased to be able to announce equal players' prize money for both our elite AFL and AFLW competitions." AFL men's competition prize money in 2022 was $1.1 million, split between the top 4 teams. The rewards pot remains the same in 2023. AFL Players Association Chief Executive Paul Marsh said it was a positive step, but more needs to be done to support women's players. "The AFL has been in discussion with us about this, and we're supportive," he said. "However, this is only a small piece of a much larger puzzle." The AFL and players are currently negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement, CBA. Through negotiations with the AFL for a new CBA for all AFL and AFLW players, further opportunities exist to grow and develop AFLW, and in doing so, the whole industry, Marsh said. "This initiative doesn't come as a substitute for the outcomes we're seeking, but it is a positive step towards them." The Matildas shone a spotlight on unequal prize money between men's and women's competitions last month, just prior to the Women's World Cup. The total prize pot for the 2023 tournament in Australia and New Zealand was $172 million, triple compared to the 2019 World Cup in France. Spain received $6.7 million as the victorious federation, in addition to the $422,000 paid to each player. Each of the Matildas received $258,000 for finishing 4th in the tournament, and Football Australia was given $3.8 million. Ultimately, this is a huge step forward for equality in women's sports, and hopefully this inspires more massive steps of its kind.
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Up next, we talk about all the good news that's happened this week. You're listening to Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Wavelength.
You're here on Fresh 92.7 listening to Wavelength. It's that time of the episode. It's heaps good news.
Trevor, take it away.
I know there's gonna be
Heaps good news on Wavelength.
The Royal Adelaide show has officially commenced, closing Sunday the 10th of September. It is great to see the show annually back in action after a break from the pandemic. As always, the show will be located at the Adelaide Showgrounds with tickets starting from $16 for the underage, with activities for the young and old with rides, live performances, farm animals, taste testing and of course, show bags. A bit of history about the Royal Adelaide show is that it started in the mid-1840s and has kept its annually tradition since, with over 30,000 entries per year exploring what Adelaide has to offer and of course getting the Birdie Beetle show bags. Banana Boogie Bakery, located in Belair, has done it again, with first claiming the title for the best meat pie in the country. The bakery now, as of August, has started serving the best sausage roll in the whole of Australia. The question is, will the South Australian-owned bakery bring tourism to boost the economy with holding the now title for best meat pie and best sausage roll in Australia? It's just the beginning for the Matildas, as they have proven they have what it takes after an incredible season. The question is, what's next for the Matildas? As the July-August FIFA World Cup women's soccer season had the nation with a full month of cheering and celebrations. Adelaide City Landmarks had shown their support by lighting up their landmarks in green to support the nationwide team to wish them luck. It's good to see the Matildas are still going strong since their debut in 1979 over 40 years ago. What do you think, Fresh Fam? Do you reckon it was a fun time for the community to get together and celebrate and cheer on the Matildas?
Sparking the convos about Adelaide you should be having. Wavelength on Fresh 92.7.
Thanks for that, Trevor. And that brings us to the end of the show tonight. Thank you so much for listening.
Make sure you're subscribed to the Wavelength podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can listen back to all our old episodes right now, and this episode will be up soon. That is officially it from us tonight.
Wavelength.